So, welcome to this Academy of Ideas discussion. Don't leave me this way. The economic impact of Brexit. I'm Rob Lyons, and I'm, as well as being Science and Technology Director at the Academy of Ideas, I'm also the convener of the Academy of Ideas Economy Forum. Not a week seems to pass without another claim that Brexit has been an economic disaster. One of the most high-profile cases was in February when Goldman Sachs claimed that the UK economy is now 5% smaller than it would have been had we not left the EU. Last week, the FT produced a video claiming a high degree of regret, even among people who voted to leave the EU. And even if it hasn't been a catastrophe, as Brexit lived up to the promises made during the referendum campaign. Sherelle Jacobs, writing in The Telegraph last week, said, "The Brexit saga has tipped into the realms of national tragedy. For some reason, it is taboo for leavers such as myself to admit that the project has been a calamity. When it comes to the B word, British politics has become gripped by a kind of violence of silence, with politicians and voters alike reluctant to confront the fallout from the country's mangled halfway situation. Britain," she said, "is terrified of freedom, and given that is the case, we might as well rejoin." So, what is the economic impact of Brexit? Before I introduce our speaker, just a word to say that our online events are free of charge, but still cost more money to put on. So if you can donate towards that cost and the work of the Academy of Ideas more generally, please visit academyofideas.org.uk/donate. So to kick off this discussion, I'm delighted that we have Catherine McBride. Catherine is an economist and a member of DBT's Trade and Agriculture Commission, an independent commission tasked with scrutinising the new trade deals for compliance with UK agricultural regulations and standards. Catherine works in financial services for 20 years, trading and advising clients on international equity and commodity markets. She campaigned for Brexit, ran the Brexit coalition in the run-up to the 2019 election, has worked in various think tanks and is a fellow of the Centre for Brexit Policy. She's also a regular contributor on the websites Briefings for Britain and Global Britain, which I can recommend. So Catherine's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then it's over to you for your comments and questions. So, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Rob. I will actually explain a little bit about my history. I'm an Australian, as I'm sure you can hear, but I've been living in the UK now for at least 35 years. In fact, I think it's longer than that, but there is a point where women stop counting these sort of things. So and when I came here with a large commodity company, and I was trading derivatives. I studied economics at university because Australia has a very strict financial services industry. I don't think in those days anyone worked in it who hadn't studied economics. It was pretty standard. And we all understood a lot about trade because we were a large island with a small population and we depended on trade. This is not the situation in the UK, by the way. It's a small island with a big population and it doesn't actually depend so much on trade. But you will never believe that if you listen to the NFU or Goldman Sachs or the FT and watch its videos, read its publications. Rob did mention a group that I write for called Briefings for Britain, and I have ripped apart all of those most recent anti-Brexit propaganda pieces, not Sherelle's one, but the others, because generally they're pretty selective with the statistics they give you. They're very good at looking at goods trades. They completely ignore our service trades, even though services are now our bigger export. Our biggest export is in fact a service industry, not a goods industry. And people seem to have trouble getting their head around that idea, especially the Financial Times, which is a weird idea because both Goldman Sachs and the Financial Times are in the service industry. And yet they keep forgetting about mentioning it. So they obviously have an agenda, and that is a shame because I think far too many policymakers and people working in government get their information from people like that. rather than looking at their own published trade statistics, which are easy for anyone to find on the internet. The ONS publishes trade statistics in every possible way you can imagine. You can find out the trade that's done by a company of the size of the company. You can find out the trade we've done by each individual industry or product. You can get into by country. So you can get into really granular stuff if you're prepared to go through its website. It doesn't advertise really easily, but I would always click on the button that goes to the website, the database. Don't muck around with anything that they pull out. I don't think they really know what they've got. But I'll give you a bit of a background into how I got involved in Brexit. When I was trading in the early 90s, I was selling derivatives on EU or countries. And in those days, there were only 12 countries in the EU. And mostly I was selling them to people in the US. And I was very aware that the EU countries were very different economically. And that was at a time when people started talking about the euro. And one thing I was very certain of was that the euro would never work and that the UK should never go into the euro, because our economy, even then, was completely out of line with the rest of the EU, which is something even our government accepted when we finally had to drop out of the ERM, the exchange rate mechanism, because we couldn't possibly keep our interest rates at a height that would align our economy with Germany's, because even then our trade was mainly with the US and we were very much geared to the US market, which meant it was virtually impossible to align us with Germany, who was the dominant and still is the dominant economy in the EU. But I never expected we'd get a referendum on it getting out of the EU. But I was very pleased when the UK did not join the euro. However, obviously, roll forward another 20 years, and we did get a referendum. And so I started volunteering at the Vote Leave office, which was a kind of automatic dialing system. So we were ringing around the whole country talking about how people were going to vote and why they should vote to leave. And you were speaking to people randomly. You know, so sometimes you got a truck driver, sometimes you got a retired bank manager, sometimes the numbers are in London, sometimes they're out of London. And it was a fascinating thing for someone like me to talk to so many people outside of the UK and listen to their stories of being in the EU. But one thing that I noticed very strongly then is every time George Osborne or Mark Carney or some other Romaniac came out with this idea that, you know, the economy would collapse if we left the EU. There'd have to be a special budget if we left the EU, which would be a punishment budget for voting to leave. He even crazily said that house prices would drop by 18% if we left the EU. And what was weird is the British public, I discovered, have a really strong bullshit meter, if I can say that on this recorded video. Every time they came out with one of these crazy ideas, ringing on the phones, we got much stronger responses. So the more George Osborne opened his mouth, the more people wanted to vote to leave. And weirdly, usually you didn't want to talk to anyone in London because London people were very aggressive about Brexit, until George told them that house prices would drop by 18%. And then even the young people in London wanted to leave because it was such an absurd idea. The idea that this was going to happen was nonsense, but they kept believing this stuff that they were being told. And when we did finally leave, sort of, we haven't left completely, and there's a lot of problems with the deal we've got. But I was then shocked at how much misinformation was going into the press about trading with the outside world. And I started to write about this because in part of my career, I had done a lot of work in agricultural commodities because they are very big global markets. And I knew that what was being repeated in the Daily Mail usually by the NFU, the National Farmers Union, who were out there spreading most of this misinformation, was just not true. And the more I wrote about farming, eventually, and commodities and how they work, eventually I was asked by the government to go on the Trade and Agriculture Commission and read the new trade deals and make sure that they were actually obeying our sort of regulations and that their commodities would suit our markets, or at least they would not be of lower standard. We weren't letting anyone undercut our standards. And that also meant I had to research the standards of all of the countries we were signing trade deals with. And it was quite eye-opening because in many respects, their standards are probably as higher than the UK's, but everyone wants to have the same outcome. You know, Australian farmers are as interested in their animal welfare as UK farmers are. You wouldn't believe that if you listen to a lot of the information that the NFU gives you constantly. But when you look into the actual regulations, which are very, extensive, you know, they have like 115 pages of how you can transport animals around Australia. And yet the NFU picked one line, taken completely out of context, and just pushed it and pushed it and pushed it without realizing that that whole regulation had umbrella agreements. So you could only ever transport an animal for 48 hours, which is the absolute maximum. And no one does because they have a lot more abattoirs than they do in the UK. They're spread all over the place because it's a big industry for Australia. This is cattle production. But if you did do that sort of long journey, there was a whole lot of caveats of what you had to do on the way. But the NFU decided to throw those out and not mention those and just push this one line. And this was happening again and again and again. So it was very frustrating to get those deals through. Was a real problem. And I think they poisoned the trough in many respects. So I think a lot of consumers now are worried about buying goods from Australia or New Zealand because they've been told they're inferior. Well, they're not inferior. But weirdly, today I've been writing a rebuttal to another piece of rubbish I've read, which is there is a woman on the internet called Liz Webster who claims to be a farmer. But 5 years ago, when she was standing for Parliament, she actually used to run a recruiting firm, placing household staff and nannies. But now apparently she's a farmer. But she said some really rude things about Namibian beef. Now, we've had a trade deal with Namibia since we were in the EU. The EU did that trade deal. We didn't do it. We just rolled it over. And here's this woman saying that you'll take your life in your hands if you eat any of this food. And it's so shocking because if you go into Namibia's websites and read about their company, not only is it approved by the British Retail Corporation and its ISO certificates, it's got halal certificates, it's got pretty much every certificate it needs to export to the EU, obviously Norway, the UK, the US, China. It can export pretty much anywhere in the world. This is a very poor country. It's got a GDP per capita of about 1/10 of the UK's GDP per capita. While it's got a lot of mineral wealth, the mineral wealth is tied up with large corporations and the government. So one way you can actually help the farmers in Namibia and the fishermen is to buy their products, which are very good. They're grass-fed. They can't afford to give them hormones or antibiotics or anything that the EU rubbishes everyone, not the EU, the NFU rubbishes everyone else for. And here are these people saying this is, you know, you'll die if you eat this. You take your life in your hands. And you sit there, how entitled are they that they would spread this rubbish about a country where its beef is all grass-fed and never goes into a shed. It's actually better treated than anything in the UK. And this is my life now, is just combating rubbish the people who should be respected, like Goldman Sachs and the FT, keep putting out. But there are other people now who are joining them on Twitter. And the Twitter lot are the worst because they never look up any of the actual published official data. And you can find this, it's so easy to find. I was going to share some spreadsheets with you, but it's probably a bit boring, and I think I might be up to my 20 minutes. But what I can tell you, which is interesting, the United Nations has recently published its World Trade, and the UK is now the fourth biggest country for total exports. That's services and goods. We've also been voted the fourth best country to invest in. We obviously, our manufacturers index is higher than the EU's, and we're sort of growing again. A whole lot of good things are happening in the UK at the moment. But there's this pressure that a lot of policymakers will buy into, that we need to align with the EU to survive. And yet we're surviving just fine without being aligned to the EU. And I think we should keep it that way for two reasons. One, we do rely on the EU for about 23% of the food we eat. And what is a major problem with that is, if you believe in global warming, and you might not, I accept that, we're going to have the same problems as most of the EU. So if anything, we're going to need to find alternative suppliers. Relying on countries whose weather could be as bad as ours in the near future would be a crazy idea. And yet people want us to do that. We heavily rely on imports, not because we don't have good farmers. We've got good farmers, but they can only produce a certain number of goods. You know, our land has not increased, but our population has. And our population's mix has changed. So we have a lot more people from, say, South Asia and Southeast Asia and China, whose basic commodity, the basic food stuff, is rice. And we can't grow rice in the UK. We would need a hell of a lot of global warming before we could grow rice here. So that we're going to have to import that. We all like eating citrus fruit and bananas and mangoes, and all of that stuff has to be imported here. So we import a lot of food that we've got used to eating, and we've got used to eating it all year round as well. So if you go to a supermarket right now and you get broccoli, it probably comes from Kenya, or beans that might have come from Egypt, might have come from Mexico. You know, we're picking up a lot of food we've all got used to having green vegetables all year round now, where 50, 100 years ago, that would never have happened. Your winter vegetables would have been potatoes and root vegetables, maybe some dandelion leaves if you were lucky, but that was about it. So, you know, we're used to trade, and it's good for us, and it's good for other countries. You know, we've helped the world get out of poverty through trade. And to try and limit it and try and convince people that somehow their products aren't good enough, when most of these developing countries have had to bend over backwards to meet our standards. And I just find it incredibly annoying when people with zero information can get hundreds of thousands of likes on Twitter and have hundreds of thousands of followers, when they're not even bothering to Google the actual information. And that's something that I really hope everyone on this call does on a regular basis. Anything you read, especially if it's in the FT or comes out of research from Goldman Sachs, check it. It takes 2 seconds half the time to check things. And you'll be amazed how often things are taken out of context, or they're not quite reported as accurately as you would have liked. And the trading goods one is one where they tried to pretend that our trade had dropped and it was all to do with Brexit. But when you went into it, what had dropped was our imports from non-EU countries. They had gone down a lot, and that was primarily from China. Now, a lot of that could have been us not buying Huawei and 5G technology from China. It could have just been that something they were building in the UK is now finished, and whatever they were importing is now, they've stopped importing it. But it's certainly a bit weird when you find the FT trying to convince you that Brexit has caused our trade to drop. And when you look into it and discover that the trade dropped with China, it had nothing to do with the EU. In fact, our EU trade was stable, and this is goods trade. You realize that these people have an agenda, and their agenda is to get us back into the EU. They don't care if they lie. They have no scruples anymore. They've lost it. There's something people call Brexit derangement syndrome. When you discover the FT will happily try and conflate trade with China with trade with the EU, you realize there's something going on. But anyhow, I will leave it there and take any questions that anyone has.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Can I just, before I go out to the floor, as it were, the virtual floor, I mean, the kind of things that you hear are that, for example, I mean, I know somebody who runs a fishing business up in northeast Scotland. Really, it's all a big kerfuffle to set up a company in Europe and meet all these standards and all the extra paperwork. And same with the Sherelle Jacobs article. That's about Brixham and about how the fishermen there are struggling. So are there some sectors that are struggling with the new trading arrangements, and maybe other ones that have benefited from opening away? What's the balance of those things?
Well, I think that fishing, as I did say to begin with, we've left, but not completely. And I think one area that was done very badly was fishing. And I think I cannot understand why continuous governments of the UK have had such a low opinion of fishing in this country. Because it didn't just start now, it started with Heath, who happily gave your amazing fishing waters away to the EU when you joined. And I think a lot of fishermen rightly expected those waters to come back when you left. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened. And it's pretty shocking. And though they set up certain rules about how fish caught in UK waters had to be landed in the UK, but I believe, and I've never actually researched this, but I have heard that that isn't happening and no one's policing it. And the fishing agreement, they have got some more fishing grounds back since we left. So it actually comes back to us. But the whole thing is meant to be negotiated next year, I believe in 2025. And that process is probably starting already. And I sincerely hope the fishing communities get themselves organised and start lobbying government. What I have noticed in my dealings with the NFU is how incredibly well organised they are as a lobbying institute. If they spent half as much time farming as they spend lobbying government, they would be like the world's greatest farmers. It's quite incredible what they've got away with. And it's also really sad that the fishermen haven't got away with the same thing. There's a movement all around the world to move fishing into farmed fish. And I'm not 100% sure about this one. Some people believe it's much better for the environment and it feeds a lot more people. But other people tell me that they are sucking the bottoms of the ocean to feed and to make pellets for the farmed fish. Other people will tell you that there's a lot of lice and they're putting a lot of antibiotics in the fish, so that there seems to be a lot of problems with this system. And yes, it has lowered the price of fish, and we can all go into a supermarket now and buy fish, but which is mostly farm fish. But I'm not sure that that's the best way of catching fish. And I really do, I agree with you. I don't think the fishing community has done well out of this at all.
Okay, right. So what I'm going to do is give Catherine a little bit of a break now, and I'll take sort of maybe 4 points from the audience. So please get your hands up. You can use the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. It's usually at the bottom of the screen for most people. And I'll take Catherine off spotlight and me. And I'll take the first question is to Mark Hill. So Mark, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great to hear from you, Catherine. It's been a while. Imports. The reason possibly for the non-EU fall in goods imports is quite likely China, but possibly it's something else other than the things you've mentioned. There's been a lot of reshoring by manufacturers that have faced increased lead times from China and increased costs and non-delivery of some items. So perhaps it's something as simple as it not being such a good supplier as it once was. And obviously this is something which is completely outside the Brexit debate. The major thing I think we were offered during the Brexit referendum was increase in trade. There were no particular promises made by the Leave side about growth, unlike the Romanians who were convinced that we were going to suffer a recession. But we were offered the possibility of major trade growth, certainly in the medium term. And that would be because we would be re-engineering our trade to the faster growing parts of the world. And we would be unrestricted as we were before 2016 in our ability to negotiate trade deals with them. Do you think that your statistics show that that has been, at least it's a developing success?
Can I just answer that one, Rob, immediately? I know you said you take 4 questions, but Mark's come up with a few good points, and I didn't plant him in the audience, but I'm glad he's here. But it is definitely China, and it is definitely office furniture has gone down a lot. I suspect that might be working from home people. I can see exactly what they've gone down in, and we've lost about 15 billion pounds worth of imports. And it's really, but you're probably right. I think things will start coming back. But on the trade thing, it's incredibly slow getting trade deals through the UK. It's been the most frustrating process. So that the Australian and New Zealand trade deals didn't come into being until the 1st of June last year. And they have kept a lot of the restrictions on the few things Australia could sell us, and New Zealand. New Zealand only really exports agricultural goods, and Australia exports a lot of iron ore and coal, things we're not going to buy, and a lot of foodstuffs as well. But the restrictions, we're keeping our tariffs on these goods for 5, 10, and 15 years, so that a £1,000 tariff has dropped to £900 or something, so that it's still far too expensive to import these things. So it's really frustrating, and that the CPTPP has gone through all of the processes, and they were originally hoping it would be enforced by summer this year. But I think even that's been pushed out a bit. And then there's the very frustrating one of something like the American trade deal, which was pretty much scuppered by chlorinated chicken. Even though the UK doesn't import chicken, we're a big chicken producer. We're very good at it. It's one of our best things. And the US doesn't really export chicken. It was the most absurd piece of propaganda you've ever heard. And yet we could be exporting lamb to the US, because the US never really developed a lamb industry, and they import 120 to 170,000 tonnes of lamb each year, almost exclusively from Australia and New Zealand. And there's absolutely no reason why the UK couldn't be in that market, except our chlorinated chicken and crazy people. They prevented that trade deal ever even seeing the light of day. And it's really shocking how anti-trade a lot of people have been in the UK, and how many politicians never called them out. No one, because I wasn't on the trade committee at the time, no one ever said, don't be ridiculous, we don't import chicken. No one said that. And it's something you can look up really easily on the DEFRA figures. Anyhow, that's another issue. Go on, Bob. Sorry.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, a couple of questions. The first of which kind of follows on from what you just said, because I'm always, just speaking generally, very suspicious about counterfactuals. In other words, you say in a parallel universe, Britain voted to stay in the EU, and then many years later, its output would have been 5% higher than it is now, Britain having left the EU. But obviously, any kind of calculation like that is based on lots and lots of assumptions which are open to question, which you've already begun to do in relation to trade. But surely there's a lot more variables. To me, any kind of comparison like that is very, very dubious. And the second question is much more specifically on agriculture, because I'm sure what you said is correct about, it's perfectly reasonable to import agricultural goods from Australia and New Zealand and Namibia and so on. I'm sure that's true. But looking at the other side of the equation, I mean, I don't follow these questions closely, but one thing that's pretty clear looking at the EU is that EU farmers are pretty pissed off with their conditions. You look at demonstrations in Brussels, in Germany, in the Netherlands, and so on. So there's huge disquiet in relation to EU agriculture itself. So are there also serious problems on that side of the equation as well, that the EU itself has got huge agricultural problems?
Okay, great. I know Ian's got some questions, so Ian, fire away. Can you unmute yourself?
I've unmuted. Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Catherine. Interesting as always. I love some of your conversations and rhetoric, which is very helpful. I've got a couple of things, if I may. I think the first thing I want to do, because I work with a lot of SMEs, small businesses that do and have done over the years a lot of trade across Europe. And one of the big things we found for the first 2 or 3 years of exit has been the small parcels debacle. Now, the paperwork you have to go through, it shouldn't be that difficult, because if you, and I have businesses that send stuff to America or to, Saudi Arabia or whatever, we're used to filling in forms. But when it comes to the EU, it's almost like it was a punishment. So we'd fill something in. I want to send something to Italy. So I fill in the due paperwork for Italy. However, what they didn't tell us is, but it's going to go to France first, then to Germany, and then to Italy. And what would happen with these small parcels, and I'm not talking about small volumes, I'm talking about mass volumes coming from any of the parcel carriers coming back, because it either failed at France, which says it's not the right documents. So at your cost, you get it back. You have to fill in a form, send it back. Then it fails at Germany because it hasn't got a German form on it. Now, the reason I'm explaining all this, and it goes through then to Italy, eventually you sort all these things out with a lot of cost, a lot of pain, and a lot of upset customers, by the way, in the EU. But in our infinite wisdom, we've said, although we've left, the other 27 nations will just treat as one. So their import documentation never changed one iota. So they could carry on shoving stuff this way, and we had to go through masses of hurdles. And the reason I'm going through that bit of detail, and I'm interested in Catherine's view, but I want to add to it, which says, who's really running this country? Is it elected officials that we voted for and we want something to happen? Or is it just some unknown financiers or the civil servants who actually didn't agree with what the populace voted for?
Okay, great. I'm just looking at the chat here, Catherine, as well. People looking for more of the macro figures, kind of getting a sense of what the overall picture has been on trade since we left. So if maybe you could just summarize that, as it were.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll start. There's some really good questions. The OBR's counterfactual is completely ridiculous. And if you go through the history of the OBR, they keep changing it. Their chairman made an off-the-cuff remark to the BBC where he said that the GDP would be 4% worse off, completely unclarified, just GDP. And that got picked up by all the media. And I suspect they've been trying to justify it ever since, because they've since turned it into GDP relative to where we would have been in the EU had we stayed, and they've changed trade into trade intensity, and they've changed a whole lot of things. They're really backpedaling here. It was always the stupid thing to say, and now it's completely stupid because of what's happening in the EU, where the EU economies are falling over, all of them, and they're all pinned to Germany. And so many of the smaller Eastern European countries had actually, their factories have started producing parts to send to German manufacturers. And then all of a sudden, when the German manufacturer doesn't have Russian gas, which was a key component, suddenly they don't need the parts from the Czech Republic or Slovakia or wherever they're coming from. So it's a real domino thing is happening over there. And to someone to try and say that we would be 4% better off if we'd stayed is completely insane. It's like, how could that even, what you mean is we'd be drowning like everyone else in the EU, but we'd be slightly closer to the water's edge than everyone else. I mean, it's like, no, we wouldn't. That's just rubbish. It was always rubbish. And the more you look into it, the more rubbish it is. And I have a friend called Derek Berthelsen, and he published something in The Critic today, which I have put on Twitter, but I can put it onto the screen notes. And he actually goes through the OBR's counterfactuals in quite detail, as I have done in an IEA paper I wrote last year, where I went through a bit of the history of it and started reading where it came from. And several people have pulled it apart, but they keep using it. And they still claim that our exports and imports will be 15% lower in 15 years' time from had we stayed in the EU. And because the only exports that could be affected by us leaving are the EU exports, that would actually require EU exports, which at the time were about 42% of our trade, would have to drop by about 37%. And it was like, well, now that the EU is collapsing, that might actually happen. But it's not happening because we left. It's happening because they relied entirely on Russian gas, which they don't have anymore. And the EU farmers are up in arms mainly about the EU's green agenda, which was very heavily geared towards farming. It had a lot to do with the nitrogen control, which the EU in its wisdom thought they would cut their nitrogen emissions by cutting farming instead of controlling their nitrogen emissions, which would obviously be a much better thing to do. And it can be done because once upon a time, the UK had a methane emission problem, which was not coming from our farms, but coming from our landfill. And if you look at the Bays, as it used to be called, it's now part of the Business and Trade Department, has the most fantastic graph of how we dropped our methane emissions by about 60% without touching farming. You know, so if you put your mind to it, you can control these things, but the EU just decided they'd get rid of farmers for some crazy reason. And weirdly, one of the countries that was most adamant they wanted to get rid of farming was the Netherlands, for whom farming is one of their biggest exports, or farm produce, not actually farming. And obviously a lot of people in the country are involved in farming, and they're the world's second biggest food exporter. It is kind of insane. I don't know why they decided to do it, but yes, you're right. The EU farmers are very angry with the EU and much more angry than our farmers. You know, we got something like 120 tractors in Westminster. They've had 10,000 tractors in the Netherlands. Everyone's got a tractor and everyone's taking it to the centre of government. But the small parcel thing, Ian, is a serious problem. And I do suspect there is an element of making it difficult, because my sister can send things to France from Australia very easily. And she does a lot because she's got some good friends in in Paris that she sends things to, and doesn't meet with the same problems that the EU has developed. Some of it is to do with the EU's VAT system, which was mentioned by an SME, or actually an even smaller, a micro company, in the FT's latest video. Though the VAT issue is being sorted out by the EU, because the EU wants to centralize the VAT and get every country to have the same VAT. Because VAT was actually invented by the European Union to give income to the European Union. So about 75% of all of the money that's collected goes to Brussels. And that's where they're quite strict on how many goods can have 0 rating and how many goods can have a reduced rating, and basically how very few things can actually be 0 rated, because they see it as their money, not the country's money. And but the actual distribution companies, I find that really weird that they would send something to Italy via France and Germany. And I suppose a bigger company has the whole container full, so it goes straight to Italy. Or if you're a small company, you're just a box in a container, and so you could be going all around the houses. And hopefully you're bringing this up with DBT, because they are doing things like this. They've developed a whole online trading platform. Well, HMRC's done it to help SMEs actually do all of their trade paperwork, so they can do it all online. And so the government is actually trying to help things, or the government, the officials, someone in HMRC is actually trying to fix this. But you really have to make sure they understand the problem. And if you want to contact me later, I can put you to my connections. They might not be able to help, but they might know where to go, who to talk to, because it is one of those frustrating things that we have an opportunity to to renegotiate to a degree the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU. And that's happening in 2026. And while I do not expect there'll be any major changes to it, because it very much suits the EU, I think it's those sort of tweaks that people will be much more interested in doing. They won't want to give up the stranglehold they presently have on us, which Theresa May gave them, but they will certainly, they'll probably be quite reasonable about fixing things like that, because that doesn't really benefit anyone. And they'll probably now calm down a bit and realize that life is going to go on, and we just keep trading with them. We're still buying their goods. They're still buying our goods. Our big companies are still selling cars and planes and plane parts and plane engines, which is the bigger issue for them. That's the money they're after. So that they should just get over this stuff, and it could well be a punishment thing, but it's more likely. I think most of these things are more cock-up than conspiracy. It's more likely that no one thought about it. No one actually thought, oh, this could be a problem, because probably when we're in the EU, our parcels were going through half a dozen EU countries, and we just didn't even know it was happening. No one was worried about it. But I think if you can send something easily from Australia to a country in Europe, you must be able to do it from the UK. And I think that that's something that the government should be interested in fixing. And okay. I'll happily try and help you do that, because it is crazy.
Okay, so I'll come out for some more points and questions. So please do chip in, raise your hand. I've got Claire Fox ready and waiting.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Just following on from Ian's small parcels point, and also because it's very tempting, and I have to say that I don't usually go for conspiracy over cock-up, but I do think there is an element of punishment that's been deployed by the EU over a period of time. However, I also feel that the the biggest problems we face are not the EU trying to restrict economic development in any way, but are much more homegrown. So one of the frustrations that I have is that any opportunities that we might have had in terms of the economy tend to be thwarted by, domestically decided policies by our own politicians and, of course, civil servants. And I say that because actually, I think sometimes we've over fetishized trade. And I wondered what you thought about that. I mean, for me, everybody talks about trade deals all the time, but isn't one of the issues that we would have wanted, at least, to have seen seriously us having the opportunity to seriously tackle the problems of productivity in the country, the problems of a lack of industrialization, of new industries, back to the economic growth thing, but new flourishing industries. And yet we ourselves have brought about so many regulations that are unnecessary. And in the past, undoubtedly the case was that the government would say, oh, it's the EU that forced us to do this. But indeed, the EU has not forced anyone to stick rigidly to a net zero target. There might be other transnational agreements that now the government blames. But what I'm saying is these are domestic problems. And so one of the things that's, I personally never believe that taking back control would solve all the problems. It just means that we have the power to do something about them at home. But I do think that one of the problems is that we have a political elite, even the Brexiteers, who don't appear to be committed to that. I just wondered if you could reflect on that. And then just finally, a small question really, is always the problem of, or not the problem, the balance in relation to politics and economics. I mean, certainly during my experience of the Leave campaign and all of the discussions around it, in many ways, people did vote Leave in spite of the threats to the economy. And it wasn't just that people thought they were made up. I mean, I talked to a lot of people who said, well, so what if they sack us? So what if we lose our jobs? It was a broader question of sovereignty. And the difficulty we now have is that because that broader question of political sovereignty is not being realized by a political elite who are adamantly refusing to take responsibility for running the country in many ways, then people go back to focusing on the economy all the time, as though that's the only thing that anyone ever voted for. This idea that, oh, well, you would never have voted for this. But actually, that was quite a big discussion, wasn't it? And people just said, well, it's not the economy stupid in this instance. Anyway, I just trying to untangle all this because it does get frustrating. And I don't want to look as though the role of people who voted Leave is always to moan or point fingers or blame people. But there is a lack of realization of the promise of Brexit. And that's not because of Brexit, but because of the people who have refused to implement what might have helped Brexit make society more dynamic, both economically and democratically.
Okay, so I'll bring in Nico and Mo and then let Catherine respond to all of that. So, Nico.
Well, actually, so I won't repeat it, but Claire's asked one of the things I wanted to ask about, which was the focus on manufacturing and productivity over trade. Although I did have an insight from your talk that the value of trade is, has, I know Adam Smith argued this, but has, allowed other economies to flourish, or our economy to flourish over hundreds of years or thousands of years even. It might be, I'd be interested to know, thinking a bit more about the high tech side of things. How do you see the position of Britain and the EU with respect to research and development? So, for instance, Britain's sort of re-entered the Horizon programme, about which I'm quite sceptical anyway. It's kind of a bit pork barrel kind of funding as far as I can see for different states and so on. But what's your, how have things changed with research and development across the EU and with respect to the UK in terms of its kind of independence, ability to pursue things? And secondly, and a bit related to that, what's your view of the EU's approach, not just to innovation, but also to regulation, and particularly around what's called high tech or big tech, which it isn't really. Particularly recently, it's slapped tariffs on Apple of 7%, I think, for sales of the iPhone. And obviously, the EU seems to be most prominent in fining companies rather than actually innovating and creating new technologies and so on. Is there any particular insights you have around that? And finally, I'm very encouraged by you can fact check in seconds using your favorite search engine. What caveats do you have? Because I do a lot of research online, but is it really as easy as you say? What mistakes do people make when they're trying to fact check trade figures on the DEFRA site or look at case studies on the BEIS site of methane emissions and so on?
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Mo.
Well, mine's a little bit of a political question, but it is kind of riffing on somebody called U2 in the chat, who asks why UK politicians not taking opportunities to reduce the cost of food, given inflation's the #1 priority. But my question's a little bit broader than that. So Claire touched on the fact that we just have a political elite that didn't particularly believe in Brexit, didn't particularly they failed to capitalise on the opportunities that might bring, both financially and politically, I think. But my question is, after the 2019 election, which was such a strong statement of belief in Brexit and wanting Brexit over the line, however fumbled that might have been, and watching the Tories just go down and down and down in the polls, and Labour sort of slowly, steadily creeping up, but also interest in politics completely waned probably because of that broken promise of Brexit. I would imagine there's a lot to do with it. So I suppose my question falls around the conspiracy and cock-up theory. I mean, how are the Tories not realising that is one of the major reasons that failing to capture the excitement of the electorate, given that 2019 election, and why are they more broadly failing to capitalise on the economic potential of Brexit?
Okay, Catherine.
Well, great. These are some fantastic questions, and I've been trying to write down all of the points you were making. But Claire, I 100% agree with you that the main benefits of Brexit was to deregulate our own markets. It was not about trade, though we have had the opportunity to do our own trade deals. But it really should have allowed us to make UK laws that suit the UK climate, environment, population, everything we do. And I think very few of those have some things have been done. And often they were done quickly and quietly the day we left through a statutory instrument that didn't get debated in Parliament. So things that we knew always hurt us more than other EU countries, such as the 3-crop rule, which stopped our larger farmers planting the crops they wanted to plant. And that only applied to farms over 30 hectares, and a lot of smaller EU countries had much smaller farms, so they weren't affected at all. We just dropped that immediately. There was a thing in the city where they wouldn't, called double volume caps, which was basically dark pool trading. That really affected our much larger investment funds that are operating out of the City of London. The markets that were caught by this were the UK and the Scandinavian markets, and I don't think France or Germany were ever caught by this. And we just dropped that too. It was no questions asked, no argument in Parliament, it just went. But there are a whole lot of other things that they haven't done. And I think it is that a lot of our public servants are either drinking the EU Kool-Aid and they believe whatever the EU does is good, or they've become very lazy and it's easier to follow the EU than to think for yourself and research whether that makes sense for the UK. Right now, there's a lot of people comparing the UK stock market with some of the European stock markets. And I was asked about this today by a city trader. And when I explained to him the difference between the 3 markets in terms of what's listed, and also went through how much of the FTSE was our biggest companies shareholding was Shell A shares, and Shell B shares was number 2. and BP was about 9th or something. But then there's a whole lot of other industries that stemmed off the oil and gas industry. So our chemical industry and our plastics industry. And we had a huge number of companies that basically used the oil and gas or as inputs to make things. And so when we cut oil and gas production, which we've been doing since 2007 with our green agenda, we also undermine not just our oil and gas companies, but who are often multinationals and they just went and got oil and gas from other places around the world. But we really undermined our refining industry and our chemical industry and our pharmaceutical industry. You know, and a lot of those industries moved to places like Italy, who doesn't have any oil and gas, but they still have big refineries, so that they're refining oil, and then they use the byproducts to make plastics or to make pharmaceuticals or to make chemicals. So that we have really shot ourselves in the foot. And as you spoke about, getting more industry back to the UK, well, a lot of those industries that involve energy, and pretty much everything involves, large quantities of energy, it's very hard to do that when you've got really expensive energy. And our commercial energy, our commercial electricity, is the third most expensive in the developed world, which is basically making us more and more service-oriented. But even services are relying more and more on large search engines. And those sort of data centers also chew up a lot of electricity. So I think that a lot of people don't realize the consequences of their action. And it might have sounded like a good idea if we'll stop producing oil and gas. I'm not sure why anyone thought that was a good idea, because our electricity still runs about 40% on gas, but we buy the gas from Norway, and Norway gets the gas out of the same North Sea that we can get gas out of, but we don't because it's against our green agenda. So there's a lot of insanity going on in the UK, in our policymakers, both politicians, but also the people advising them, who are telling them that this is a good thing, who have not really thought it through properly and looked at what it is we're good at and what we do. And I think that comes in a bit to the thing Nico was talking about in terms of improving our productivity. And we want to move into a high-tech sector. Well, that's really a good idea for us, because we do have a very big and very well-developed university and education sector. And obviously, a lot of those universities are getting into our research and development. And hopefully, one rule that I think we're also changing is we've got rid of the EU's aversion to developing new crops using either gene editing or gene modification. And that was something we were always really good at, but we couldn't actually use what we developed. And instead, our best scientists were getting moved to the US, where they could actually use it. The insane part about that bit of EU legislation is that the EU actually allows the import of GM soybeans from Brazil to feed their cattle. So though they won't let their farmers grow GM soybeans, they do import them and they do feed them to their animals that are later happily sold to us or produce milk to sell to us as cheese or butter. And no one bats an eyelid about that, but they won't actually let the farmers grow them. So there's a lot of crazy things in the EU's attitude towards technology and development. And obviously the Apple thing, I think, is probably more to do with tax. I mean, the EU, Apple has been running itself through Ireland for a long time, and through the Irish tax system was able to get down to paying a mere 1% in tax, because Ireland allows you to write off pretty much everything, and it allows companies to do aircraft leasing agreements, and the aircraft can be depreciated very quickly, which gives a company that doesn't actually make aircraft, but just merely buys them and leases them out to airlines, the ability to write down the cost of those airlines pretty quickly against their profits from their iPhones or whatever. And that is the key to the Irish economy. And it's not just Apple, there's a lot of companies doing it, but the EU did try to, well, they took Ireland, I think, to court about Apple. And I think they lost, but they're obviously trying another route to get the money back out of Apple. So they have some crazy ideas. In terms of fact-checking numbers, whether it's right or it's wrong, the ONS is the official figures. So if you want to talk about trade, I have to use the ONS because that's the official figures. If I want to talk about the ONS's, the UK population, even though there's a lot of different sources that will tell you the population, the ONS is the official figures, so we have to use it. In terms of DEFRA, the other group I really use a lot is Comtrade, who will give you the figures for the rest of the world. The tricks are, though, that DEFRA has its own system of calculating stuff, which is in line with the EU, and they will calculate meat and animal production by what they call carcass weight. So they assume what the whole animal would have weighed, even though you're only going to export the meat. They kind of like to count it as if it still had all the bones and stuff in it. It's a kind of crazy way that they introduced, I think, to reduce imports from other countries. I can't really think of any other reason why anyone would do this. And once upon a time, people did export whole carcasses around the world. But at least 20 years ago, probably 30 years ago, someone worked out, oh, we can butcher that in our own country and just sell the bits that people want. So you don't sell the whole carcass. So New Zealand, for instance, who I think really pioneered this, breaks up a lamb carcass into 40 different pieces and sells every piece to a different country, because some countries like different parts of the lamb, and it's all gone somewhere. And even if the last bits go into dog meat somewhere, but whatever, it all sells, and no one has to buy the whole carcass and then throw half of it away. So they're the tricks. There are three major sites to use. The ONS is the official one. DEFRA is very good for agriculture in terms of weight, because really agriculture, you need to look at the quantity rather than the value. And Comtrade does both, and it does it for the whole world, and it does it in whatever currency, and it has the most useful website and database. You can search really quickly on it. But it never quite matches the others because I think of the conversion of the currencies, but it does allow you to look at reverse trade. So you can see what the UK thinks it sold countries, and you could look at the reverse and see what those countries thought they sold the UK, which is always interesting. But I will always defer to the ONS because it's the official figures. And they get them from HMRC. We will also find, since we left, we now get real trade data. When we were in the EU, you got data from the EU Infostat, which is kind of a guesstimate because, as it's been pointed out already with small parcels, no one was actually counting a lot of the trade that was going around in the EU. So people just kind of guessed, quite frankly, and they still guess. So a lot of what they say, oh, everyone's trading in the EU, you're going, well, how can you tell? How do you know? Where people do know about the trade is in the big trade when it had parts or bits that were coming from other countries, because then the EU is suddenly interested in that because they obviously get to charge import duty on that. So they know about the big bits, but they often don't know about the intra-country trade, especially if it's small bits. And yet they publish figures on all of this. So they probably do a survey and then they stick their finger in the air and go, oh, it's probably plus or minus 5% or whatever. But that is the joy for someone like me of leaving the EU is we can now get real figures. But I just thought of something else that Claire said, which is very, very true. People did understand, you're right, the Remain side only saw the referendum as an economic issue. I suppose because they couldn't say out loud, we don't want to be in charge, we don't want to be the government, we like being elected and taking a lot of money, but we don't want to actually do anything. So they just went on and on and on about the economy. But the other side, I think that was really key, that we are now in a position where we can make rules that suit us. Because we did collect a lot of really stupid rules that have nothing to do with the UK. Some have gone from the retained EU law, but when the government had its, was basically a big spreadsheet, but they gave it a silly name because they obviously don't deal with spreadsheets a lot, but you could look down all of the rules we had, and there were rules that had nothing to do with the UK, but they're on our statute books. I do believe they should have just been, removed immediately, but everyone was worried that they might affect something else. And as I've said about the small parcels, there is an element where things happen that no one thought about. But there is a point where you have to have a process of eliminating all of these rules. And you have to look at our tariff structure as well. There is no reason for us to still have tariffs on olive oil that comes in from Turkey. We will never grow olives in this country either, and yet we still have tariffs on olive oil. We still have tariffs on bananas. Really, seriously, we have tariffs on pineapples. We have tariffs on a whole lot of things that we are never, ever going to produce. And they claimed that this was to help them negotiate trade deals. But as someone else has said, why haven't they lowered the cost of food? Well, this is one of the reasons why the cost of food has not been lowered, is because we still have tariffs on a whole lot of things that we eat and use, and often it's ingredients in stuff we make. People forget that some of our biggest food production companies became world dominating multinationals when everything they made was imported. So before we knew how to grow sugar beet in this country, which didn't start till the 1920s, companies like Cadbury's and Roundtree's and Fry's all imported the sugar, imported the cocoa beans, imported the cocoa paste, imported the whole thing, turned it into chocolate and sold it all back to the world, and everyone thought it was magnificent. Yet none of that stuff is grown here. And people often get a bit obsessed about being self-sufficient, when in fact we've developed really big industries out of things where we have to import all the stuff that goes into it. And I don't know why I'm mentioning that. Lost my train of thought, but anyhow, so that there are food could be a lot cheaper here. We could bring in olive oil from South Africa. It makes very good olive oil. Olive oil from Turkey, it's a very good olive oil. We don't. And rice, we still have massive tariffs on rice, which drives me crazy, because we just did a trade deal with Vietnam, part of the CPTPP. It's the 4th biggest rice exporter in the world. We kept a quota on their rice. Who are we protecting? Italian rice growers. I mean, you just couldn't make it up. There are things that we deal with in the Trade Commission where I look at what they've done and just think, whose side are these people on? Who is determining these trade deals? Because there are some crazy things in it which make no sense, and they just make food more expensive for everyone else. And, we're the same size island with close to 70 million people, and we've had an EU authority keeping our food production at a sort of 18th century way. Someone once, I think it was a politician, referred to the EU as a museum of agriculture. And yes, and it's a nice idea to keep sort of traditional ways of doing things. But if your population keeps increasing, you have to get more food from somewhere. And if we're going to get more food imported, then we should be dropping the tariffs on that imported food.
Okay, Catherine. I'm going to let's a final round of questions, right? So I've got John and I've got Susan, who I can't get her hand up, I don't think, and Phil, and then I've got a little test for you right at the end. But first of all, John, if you would like to come in.
Yes, hello. There are perhaps three main ways in which, at least in principle, Brexit can affect the economy. The first is through affecting trade flows. The second is through affecting business investment. And the third is through affecting immigration. And I think we've spent most of the time here talking about trade flows. I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about business investment and how Brexit has or may have affected business investment. I think it's generally considered that business investment is low in the UK. I think it's the lowest in the G7 at the moment. You probably know the figures better than I do. I may be wrong, please correct me. I don't know whether you think it should be higher, but what is the role of Brexit in affecting business investment? I mean, one argument that has been presented or was presented at the time of the vote was that the vote created a lot of uncertainty. We'd no idea what deal we'd come up with in a few years when negotiations had been concluded, and all this uncertainty would really affect business investment. Is there any evidence that this sort of uncertainty did affect investment? And more generally, what are your thoughts about business investment in the UK?
Okay, great. And Phil?
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Catherine, for all your points. There's a few questions in the chat asking for more sort of data. And so I'd just like to recommend your own, Catherine's document, which Rob had flagged up, I think, in the blurb for this session, which was the one you wrote for Global Britain last year, Catherine, on, what has changed. Just to blow your, to recommend it highly, because I think what Catherine's done there is a level of sectoral analysis which very few other people have done. What that means is that rather than just talking about aggregate figures, how much exports has gone up, how much imports have changed, and so on, Catherine's gone through about 20 or more sectors. And each of those sectors tells, its own peculiar story. And I think it's already very helpful, because what it does is not just refute the claims of the lingering remainers that this has caused so much damage, and makes the if you wanted to sum it up in one sentence, which I don't think you can really, but you do, through that sectoral analysis, illustrate why the problems with British trade long precede Brexit, whether it's the vote or actually leaving the European Union. If people just look at one section of it, which is on pharmaceuticals, which Catherine sort of mentioned in passing but didn't really go into. I mean, it was an eye-opener for me, Catherine, that the pharmaceuticals industry has gone from being something which was, a contributor to the trade surpluses just 10 years ago or 12 years ago. But over the course of the last decade, well before Brexit, the pharmaceutical manufacturing sector has collapsed. It's gone from, I think somebody reported it as the pharmaceutical industry was fourth in the world in trade balance in 2008 or 2009. It's now 98th by the time you get to 2019. So all this got nothing to do with Brexit. I think that's the main point that Catherine draws out through this analysis, is that there are lots of trends about why Britain is exporting or not exporting, but that they've got absolutely nothing to do with Brexit itself. Now, moving on from there, so anyone who wants more data, do look up that document that Rob's given the link to. More broadly, on the points of people making about why is this why have British politicians missed the opportunity, or why have they not sort of realised, what could have happened, the benefits that could have happened from Brexit. I'd just like to pose this slightly different way. I think one of the problems we have now is that the old sort of Brussels excuse has been replaced by a Brexit excuse. Now, what I mean by that is that before we left, on all sorts of issues, British politicians would use the fact that we were members of the European Union to avoid taking responsibility for things, not just in economics, but in other areas. And that sort of refrain, which we had for decades and decades, of saying, well, we can't really do that because Brexit tells us because the EU says we can't do it. And as Catherine's already said, there's so many ludicrous rules which Britain was supposed to follow, and whether it actually did or not was a different matter. But the main thing was the way in which the British governments, Labour and Conservative, would avoid responsibility, and by saying, well, we've outsourced that to the European Union, so wipe our hands of it, it's nothing to do with us. And I think that Brussels excuse was something which disguised what other people have referred to already or questioned, which is why are British politicians so useless? Why are they not doing anything? And that sort of responsibility which they have for failing to realize any vision, any strategy on anything, with the possible exception of net zero for bizarre reasons, they were able to sort of rid themselves of that responsibility. With Brexit, they couldn't do that anymore. They can't say, well, the reason we're not doing this is because Brussels tells us we can't. But ironically, what's happened, I think, is not just that people who are still Remainers, the Remainiacs that Catherine talked about, the people who've got an agenda, and I'm sure there are still people who want to get Britain back into the EU and so on, who have that sort of agenda. But I think the problem is broader than that, because it's become just an accepted fact, regardless of all the facts that Catherine and others can throw at them. It's become an accepted fact amongst mainstream commentators that Brexit has been a damage, that Brexit is responsible for productivity problems, that Brexit is responsible for investment problems, Brexit is responsible for trade problems and all sorts of things, when it abjectly isn't, as the facts show. But it has become an accepted wisdom. And it's one of those other pretext. That's why I say the Brussels excuse for not doing anything is replaced in some ways by a Brexit excuse, which both distracts from what the real problems that the British economy has, the low investment, the low productivity, the high energy prices, umpteen other things we can talk about, the regulation which Britain has continued despite not being in the European Union and so on. But it also lets the politicians off the hook. Because if everyone agrees that there's an investment problem, say, everyone agrees Britain is an economic malaise, then the first go-to explanation that people give, well, it's that nasty Brexit that caused this. It's demography as well, and it's deglobalization perhaps. But the one that they all refer to, even, respectable think tanks like the Resolution Foundation, we're not talking about the OBR, we're not talking about the Bank of England, we're talking about, mainstream economic commentators will always throw in, well, of course, Brexit's caused this problem. And it's a way of avoiding then taking responsibility, and it allows politicians to turn and say, well, I voted for Brexit, or I campaigned for Brexit, or I didn't. But anyway, we're in there now. But, that's one of those burdens which we're going to have to live with for the future. So it's a way of avoiding taking responsibility now. And I think that's why it's so valuable to popularize the work that Catherine's done and others have done to actually expose that Brexit is not the cause of British economic malaise. The problems go back much earlier and are much deeper, and they will continue for as long as politicians evade taking responsibility from them, from wherever political party they are.
Okay, let's have Susan. Hi. If you can unmute yourself. Yes, we got it.
Yeah. Catherine, I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving us these briefings, because it's the first time in a long time that I've heard anything remotely uplifting about us coming out of Europe. But I have made a few notes, and I would just appreciate some comments from you. You mentioned that the EU has meted out quite some forms of punishment to us because we took this step. You also mentioned that Theresa May, in her negotiations, gave the EU a stranglehold. And I just wondered, because I was present at a meeting about a couple of weeks ago when a gentleman gave us some information about the possibility that the Labour government is going to align us with the EU on defence procurement. And you mentioned something about us being able to sell them aeroplanes, and I just wondered if you had any information on how that might affect our ability to do that, if in fact we do become aligned with the EU on defence procurement. There are two other areas that they're trying to align us with, but I just wondered if you had heard about that and what your response might be. The other thing too, and Claire Fox mentioned this, that a lot of the hindrance to the success of us leaving Europe is coming from inside. And I do believe that. I've got indications of it very, very strongly. So my question to you, if there is a joy of leaving the UK and you've got a wonderful message, one, what avenues do you use to get this good news out? Because we're not hearing it. The man on the Clapham omnibus doesn't know anything about this. How do you get this in an understandable way out to the masses? What avenues can you use to do that, if in fact that is, with everything else you're trying to do? And I guess the thing is, which party is going to change this? Because our current government has done nothing. They've betrayed the whole idea of it, and I am very, very fed up with it. So who is going to change it? Who is going to really make Brexit work, that we have left the EU? And that's my question and my comment.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Right, so Catherine, so respond to any of that, but I suppose there's been a thing chugging away in the chat, and I suppose people really want the kind of 1 or 2 minute how to, in plain terms, respond to the Brexit has been a disaster point, because I think there's a lot of people here who kind of get that idea but wouldn't know how to put it succinctly. So maybe that could be your rounding off, I don't know. But anyway, respond to anything you want.
Okay, well, we started with someone asking about investment, and strangely, it was just accepted, I think, by everyone that investment would go down because of the uncertainty. Because of, when Theresa May was the Prime Minister, she was threatening to leave without a deal one day, and then she was postponing the exit date the next day. She put in Article 50, which was our 2-year time limit to leave, without really having a plan and knowing what she wanted to do. And so I've always believed that our investment, rightly, was lower because of that uncertainty. And if I was a big international investor, I would have been a bit skeptical about investing in the UK at the same time. So I have no problem with accepting that. But weirdly, I have seen statistics, and I am trying to find them, and I will try and get them to Rob at some stage, and he can maybe post them, that show that actually that didn't happen as much as people expected it to. But then also recently we have seen investment increase again, because if someone was planning on doing an investment in the UK, now that things have sorted out, and once the TCA was signed and agreed to, there's no reason why investment shouldn't come back to the UK. And there was, I hope you all also follow Julian Jessup, who used to work with me at the IEA, and he put up something on Twitter literally, to this afternoon, sometime just before this meeting started, showing that the UK is now the 4th best place to invest in the world. And that's after sort of the US, China, and Canada, and then the UK. So we're ahead of any other EU country. So yes, I can imagine that investment was lower. However, I have seen statistics where people say it wasn't as bad as it was meant to be. But it did sound reasonable. So I think I bought into it, and most people accepted that without ever checking it. But now it would appear that we have become a much more interesting place to invest in. In terms of the very nice things that were said about this analysis I did by Phil, which was done last year, and you'll be happy to know if you got through to page 90, but that I'm redoing it this year. I'm updating all the figures because it was a very difficult thing that once we had annual figures after Brexit, that had also coincided with COVID, and it was very hard to try and piece out what was COVID and what was Brexit. Because COVID, obviously, we had factories closed all around the world, and we also had a travel ban, and some of the UK's biggest exports are involved in aircraft parts, both engines and wings and seats. And all of the big commercial airlines were mainly parked on the tarmac at the airports and had no money whatsoever to invest in new planes. So that really hit our exports very much. And so I went through it sector by sector and compared our trade with EU countries and our trade with non-EU countries, because the ONS very generously gives us all of this information. They don't deflate it, so it was in current prices. But if you wanted to look at the granular sector by sector trade and compare it with EU and non-EU, I discovered in most sectors, the two areas followed exactly the same pattern. So that you could see that that was not a Brexit effect, that was a COVID effect. There were a couple of industries where that didn't happen, and trade with the EU dropped dramatically, and trade with non-EU countries continued to carry on as normal. And often that was to do with the rules of origin. And as Phil said, that a lot of industries, the decay started in 2010, and sometimes a bit before that. And then things like pharmaceuticals, we started losing it when we stopped having cheap power, and it moved to Switzerland and it moved to Italy. And then when Ireland changed its tax structure, all production moved to Ireland. So, and you can see that quite clearly. I mean, it hasn't dropped off a cliff. We still export a reasonable amount of pharmaceuticals, but it has been flatlining. And if you were able to deflate that, which would be tricky, you could do it with just a currency, but you couldn't really do it by product. You would see that, obviously it's gone down. But we've kept a lot of the research and development in the UK, and obviously we have a tax advantage to people, so they can write off their research, but when they want to actually produce the goods, they're going to produce them in Italy or Switzerland or Ireland. Or they're going to produce them in Switzerland and run their profits through Ireland, which is probably better. Anyhow, that's what's happening. And that's also happening in our oil and gas industry, obviously, and plastics. And quite a few things started to drop when we developed a green agenda, which to lead the world, and no one else seems to be following us. And Germany's opening up coal mines, and we're not batting an eyelid about it. Defence procurement is tricky. The EU have been trying to drag the UK back into their PESCO arrangement, something that they swore that, or not they, the people who wanted us to remain in the EU kept saying that the EU would never have an army, etc. Well, the EU now has an army in theory, but they would like us to provide them with the soldiers and the equipment and the know-how, because a lot of EU countries, have never really been that interested in their own defence. The worst offender is Germany, who puts in less than 1% of their GDP into NATO, and they say it will be another 10 years before they can afford to put in 2%. The good news is that it's the new members of the EU are worth doing deals with, but most of them have signed up to NATO. There's, Poland, Estonia, Finland. These guys are all serious about their own defence. But EU procurement, what does that mean? That means they're going to pay for our equipment? Well, I'm not so sure that they are going to do that. I'm not the expert on this. I do know someone who has spent as much time looking at EU defence, a man called David Banks. I don't think he's on this call, but but I can recommend he can do a talk at for at any time you'd like to talk about defence procurement, and he knows all about it and all about PESCO, what they're doing, what they're not doing. But I think something that's come up a lot, and certainly came up, I think the last question from Susan was, how do we change this? And I think for the last 40 years, we've had more and more people going into politics who knew they didn't have to do anything. And I think, as Phil said, the new excuse is Brexit. So anything goes wrong, it was Brexit's fault. Just as 10 years ago, anything that went wrong was the EU's fault. And some of it is absurd, the things that have been blamed on Brexit. But we change it by electing politicians who want to be there with life experience. As I said at the very beginning, I came to London and was working in the city and had virtually nothing to do with anything that happened in Westminster. And it's only since the Brexit referendum where I've been involved in things in Westminster. And I've been really shocked at how young the people are there and how many of them went from PPE degrees, from a nice private school to PPE in Oxford, to maybe a few years in a think tank. And it doesn't matter if it's a left-leaning or a right-leaning think tank. And then they get into a party as a parliamentary assistant and eventually a SPAD, and then they get a nice safe seat. And they've never been in the real world. They've never had to send a small parcel to their aunt in France. They've never had to, look at procurement of, they've had zero life experience. And we're asking them to do what in the city would be a major corporate structural change. And there are people in the City of London who do this all the time for large multinationals. And they're the sort of people we need to be bringing into government. The more I look at it, I know lawyers who could have negotiated 1,000 times better contract with the EU than the one we got. But the people negotiating for us had never done a negotiation before. I mean, Oliver Robbins knows nothing about a negotiation. He's not a negotiator. He's not even a businessman, Why on earth he was put in charge of that process was kind of insane. And, we've made some really bad choices because no one has been looking around for the best man for the job or the best woman for the job. They have been just picking up whoever's standing beside them and saying, you can do it. And we've got a lot of politicians who are quite happy to take their £80,000 a year and get involved with local constituency issues, often issues that should be dealt with by the council, and don't really know how to run even a company, let alone the whole country. And I think that that's happening more and more. And I've worked with some great people in the Trade Department, the young people who are working in there. They're really clever and they want to learn, but there's no one to teach them. The TAC has been really interesting because they have gathered together some really top trade lawyers and people like myself, people from the NFU. We've actually got farm experts on that list. We've also got people who are involved in testing food that comes into the country. Got people involved with the Red Tractor group are in there. So there's a lot of experts in their field. And the kids that are there working for the Trade Department, they're all absorbing knowledge like sponges, but you sort of sit there going, wow, these people should be more, the people who are just there scrutinizing the deal after it's done, why weren't some of them involved in actually doing the deal? And I think if that's happening in trade, and trade's been really good. Trade is the best department in the whole government, as far as I can see. They've really grabbed the ball and they're running with it. But most of the others, I think, are terrified because they have no experience of this. They've never run a company. They've never worked in any industry. They've only ever had to do whatever the EU told them to do. And if anything went wrong, they blame the EU. And yeah, I think that we've got a lot of we're having an election at sometime in the next 6 months. I don't care which party you vote for, but vote for an MP who has had some experience doing something. They don't need a PPE degree. They don't need anything else, but they do need to have worked somewhere and know something about the industry that they're, you know, maybe they're a teacher, maybe they're a nurse, maybe they're, you know, you can't expect people who've never used the NHS to run it properly. And yet we are. You can't expect people who went to some really expensive private school to work out what's wrong with the state school system. And yet we are. You know, you can't expect people who've never run a company to run your country. And yet we're doing it. And we're going to get an election. We have to change our politicians. And I'm not at all involved in any parties at the moment. My experience so far is that they're virtually the same thing. And I'm really hoping that we get some better MPs. I know a lot of them are standing down in the next election, and hopefully we get better people, and maybe they're going to be independents, maybe they can come out of a different system. But you know, that would be the only way we change this.
Okay, so Catherine, we've kind of gone over time.
Yeah, sorry.
But that last question that I asked you, I suppose it'll have to be 60 seconds now. If you just had to make a point to somebody who's like, you know, convinced that Brexit's been terrible, if you could say in 60 seconds, this is why it's not been terrible, what would you say to them?
Because it's in our own hands now. Someone asked me before it even happened, back in 2018, what Brexit would be like, and I said it's going to be as good as we make it, and it is up to us to make it good. Certainly, trade has not collapsed. Anything they say about our trade's collapse is rubbish, and just call them out. Just say, show me the figures. Where did you get those figures from? Show them to me, because they can't produce those figures because it didn't happen. But for everything else, you've got to say, well, why aren't you trying to make it better? You know, people say it's been a disaster. We go, well, why is that? You know, everything in life is as good as you make it to be. You know, if you're running a company, it will be as good as you put the effort in to make it good. And it terrifies me that people kind of expect stuff to happen without any effort. We've become this instant gratification world. And you're going, well, it's as good as you're going to make it. And if you sit around moping and doing nothing, you know, it's like, who's set up a import company and gone to New Zealand and discovered they sell the most amazing things there? You know, no one, because we don't want to make it a success. We want to sit here and say, well, this has been terrible. You know, and there is that in the UK. I hate to say it. You know, there's not the get up and go people got up and left years ago, and we've got to find some new ones. Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave it on that happy note. So, Catherine, thank you very, very much for your contributions tonight. This is all never works, but if you would like to unmute yourselves, all of you, and give Catherine a round of applause, it won't sound very good, but never mind.
Welcome. Very good.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Rob, and I'll happily do this again if you can bear it.
Okay, so just to finish off, so thank you again, Catherine. If you enjoyed this discussion, you should consider coming to our biggest event of the year, the Battle of Ideas Festival, which takes place in London on the weekend of the 19th and 20th of October. Catherine's been speaking the last 2 or 3 years, so hopefully we'll see her again at that festival alongside hundreds of other speakers and thousands of other people in attendance, a place where free speech and free thinking are allowed, and there's early bird tickets available right now at battleofideas.org.uk/tickets. If you can donate, please visit academyofideas.org.uk/donate. A donation is always very, very welcome, and you can also find out about joining the Academy of Ideas as well. That gives us a little bit more long-term funding, and you get discounts on events like the Battle of Ideas Festival. And do keep up with us on Substack as well. For the link for that, just go to the Academy of Ideas homepage, and there's a link there through to our Substack there, and for all our upcoming events and so on. Right, so Thank you again, Catherine. Thank you all for your contributions tonight's discussion. I'll stop the recording, but I'll leave the meeting open for another 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. And if people want to chat, that's great as well. Thank you again.
I'd just say, Rob, that not only have I spoken at the Battle of Ideas, I've attended the Battle of Ideas. It is the best weekend you can ever spend in London. It's fantastic. You get the greatest speakers. You're willing to debate the most incredible topics. No one is terrified. There's no sort of snowflake, we can't speak about that. It's just brilliant. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And if you have me back, I'll happily speak at it again. But even if you don't, I'll attend. I'll be there.